I'm going to start with chapter 23, verses 1 through 4, and then 17 through 19. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were all the years of her life. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. When Abraham got up from beside his dead wife, he spoke to the Hittites, I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so I can bury my dead. So Ephraim's field at Machpelah in Mamre, the field with its cave and all the trees everywhere within boundaries of the field, became Abraham's possession in the sight of all the Hittites who came to the gate of the city. After this, Abraham buried his wife Sarah in the cave in the field at Machpelah near Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field with its caves passed from the Hittites to Abraham as burial property. Now we'll read chapter 24, verses 1 through 9. Abraham was now old, getting on in years, and the Lord had blessed him in everything. Abraham said to his servant, the elder of his household, who managed all that he owned, place your hand under my thigh, and I will have you swear by the Lord, God of heaven and God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. But you will go to my land and to my family and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, suppose the woman is unwilling to follow me to this land. Should I have your son go back to the land that you came from? Abraham answered him, make sure that you don't take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from my native land, who spoke to me and swore to me, I will give this land to your offspring. He will send an angel before the Lord, and you can take a wife for my son there. If a woman is unwilling to follow you, then you are free from this oath to me, but don't let my son go back there. So the servant placed his hand under the master Abraham's thigh and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. This is the word of the Lord.
So 30 years ago this month, Disney released the animated film, The Lion King. And yes, that was 30 years ago. The movie starts and ends with a song called The Circle of Life that attempts to give meaning to the lives that creatures find themselves living on Earth. It talks about things like the interconnectedness of humans and animals, dependence on each other to survive, and it does all of this to try and give hope in the midst of the hard things we face in life. The song teaches us that death and life and endings and beginnings are all a part of the natural order of things. And there's a reason for it all, even if we can't see it. So just trust nature's whims. The song goes, it's the circle of life, it's the wheel of fortune, it's the leap of faith, it's the band of hope till we find our place on the path unwinding in the circle of life. Maybe you can hear Elton John singing it in your head right now. I'm not going to try to do it. As I was reading the passage for today that we're covering, it reminded me a little bit of the circle of life. We see some endings and we see some beginnings. We kind of see this changing of the guard. Abraham possesses land for the first time in our story. As his wife Sarah passes on, it essentially becomes a burial plot. And then he gives to his son Isaac the role of the new patriarch, and a faithful servant goes on a journey to find the new matriarch to take Sarah's place. And the story rolls forward, and as we read the narrative, we're left asking, is this simply the circle of life? Just the random balancing out of the order of nature as we stumble into our places and roles at the whims of death itself? Or is there a God who is sovereignly at work, providing a place and a people for our good and for his glory? So good morning again, New Eden. Welcome to this gathering of the church. I haven't introduced myself yet. If I've not met you, my name is Joel. I get to serve as one of the pastors here at New Eden Church. And so as always, it's a joy to see your faces and just gather with you. As you can see, we are continuing in our Genesis series. We are covering the entire narrative from 23 to 24. It's quite a bit, so I'll mostly just be summarizing the narrative as we move forward, but feel free to try to follow along as best you can. If you've been with us for a while, you know that we've been following the life of Abraham and his family for quite some time. Last week, Kevin preached on chapter 22, where this story, kind of the climax of Abraham's story, where God provides this ram on a mountain that he names the Lord will provide, just this explicit gospel picture. It's beautiful. And so our story today will cover the passing of Isaac's mom and dad, Sarah and Abraham, and their family beginning to possess some land. And in the midst of it, Abraham's servant finding a wife for Isaac. And so quick roadmap for today, kind of two main points is what I have. Foretaste of a future place. That's all of chapter 23. And then foretaste of a future people. That is all of chapter 24. And so kind of this framework will guide our time together today. And so we're going to quickly start by looking at chapter 23 and the foretaste of a future place. A foretaste of a future place. So you just heard it read, but in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 23, we're kind of told fairly quickly as a commentary note that Sarah passed away. After a long, hard life, she passes at 127 years old. If we followed her journey, she's faced barrenness most of her life. She had a doubtful relationship with God often throughout her journey, not fully trusting him. She was taken advantage of and used by her husband. We at least see 2 times recorded, and it seemed to be a pattern. But through it all, God was faithful. And the last thing we read of Sarah is that she was brought laughter through God's faithfulness to keep his promises. He brought her to a place of rest at the end of her life. And so she passes on, and the narrative makes it clear that Abraham mourned, he cared for his wife, he wept for her. So we're hoping that that relationship continued to grow as they were both sanctified. So he cares for her in the fact that he mourns over her, but also in the care with which he buries her, takes care of her dead body. And that's what the rest of chapter 23 covers. Okay, and so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but there is this long back and forth. Culturally, it would have been the normal bartering of the day. In verse 4, Abraham starts by clearly naming his request. Hey, I want a burial property. He tells this to the Hittite people where he was staying at the time. They offer him an option. Hey, well, you can just use one of our places and use one of our burial plots, which would have been more maybe like what we expect, like just to throw it in a cemetery, right? But Abraham's like, no, like I want actual possession of land. And so he goes to the gate of the city, which if you remember, this is where transactions took place. And this is kind of a public thing. So everybody knows this is what's going on. He bows down and he requests, for whatever reason, this guy Ephron, or you can pronounce it Ephron if you're a High School Musical fan. But so he goes to this place and he says, hey, I want to buy this specific piece of property from this guy. And the text makes it clear that in the city gate, they barter a little bit, but in the sight of all the people, Abraham comes into clear possession of this piece of property, and it's where he buries his recently deceased bride. So the reason so much time is spent telling about this acquiring of this piece of property is, first of all, this place would be renamed quite a bit in the scriptures. Those that were Israelites that would have read this text for the first time knew exactly what this property was. And so this is kind of the origin story of how this property happened. It's the same place where Abraham will be buried. Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah all will be buried on this property. So it's kind of an origin story. But probably even more important than that, from a theological perspective, this is recording the only piece of land that Abraham comes to possess in his lifetime. Remember, he stood out and was promised this entire land as far as his eye could see, north, south, east, west. But the story ends, because right after this, chapter 25, he dies. The story ends with him having this small piece of property. There's no city or civilization built on it. There's no walls built up for security. And then all these people as numerous as the stars in the sky living here and life teeming. That's not happening at all. Just a place for a bunch of dead bodies to be buried. But what if Abraham really believed that he actually was looking for a land whose builder and maker was God? So he was content with a small plot of land upon which to bury his dead, trusting that God would raise them up in the last day and give them an inheritance even bigger than he could ever dream. And in this light, The acquiring of this piece of property stands as a foretaste. Yes, of the nation of Israel possessing the land someday, but even further beyond that. And so in chapter 23, we see a foretaste of a future place. And then in chapter 24, we see the foretaste of a future people. In verse 1 of chapter 24, it's written in a way that assumes the passing of some time as Abraham gets older in years. And just as crucial as Isaac was to the fulfillment of God's promises, so is a wife for Isaac to continue the promised seed. Now, this section of scripture is significant because it is clearly changing the focus from Abraham as the recipient of God's promises to now passing on to the rest of his family as it continues to expand. So Abraham, he knows he's getting on up in years. He grabs his trusted servant and he asks him for assistance in finding Isaac a wife to continue the family name. Now, most commentators agree that this trusted servant is probably the man named Eliezer that Abraham mentioned later. He was the one that Abraham assumed would be the heir before Isaac was born. And so Abraham grabs him. They've lived a lot of life together. He asks him to enter into this serious oath to bring Isaac a wife back from Abraham's homeland. Now, this wasn't about ethnicity. This was rather about allegiance to Yahweh. And so Eliezer enthusiastically agrees to help Abraham. Now, this is significant and incredibly selfless because remember, if it wasn't for Isaac, Eliezer most likely would have been the recipient of all the wealth that Abraham had acquired. He said that earlier. But the text makes it clear that he trusts God's plan and he's willing to play whatever role God would have him to. He'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than anything else. And so he goes back to Abraham's original homeland. We don't have time to look at all the details, but one of the things that stands out is the servant's utter reliance on God throughout the whole process. You can go back and read it later. Every step he takes, every move he makes, it's surrendered to Yahweh. Yes, God is sovereign. He is working, he is moving, but he has also sovereignly chosen to work through the prayers and surrendered lives of men and women, and that is how this story moves forward. So he's led by God. The servant, this is back at Abraham's original homeland. He meets a woman at the well. He doesn't know it yet, but it's a woman named Rebekah, who is Abraham's great niece, which if I did this right, it would make her Isaac's first cousin once removed, okay? Culturally, yes, for us, that's weird. That culture wasn't strange at all. And many times it was actually preferred as cultural norms and understandings would be more easily passed on. And so he starts having a conversation with her. He finds out who she is. He's even more excited. He continues. You watch him the whole time. He's just responding with gratitude for God's kindness throughout the whole story. And so eventually they go from the well to Rebekah's family, and we get to meet some other characters. We meet Laban, who you're going to see him come up later in the narrative. It's Rebekah's brother. He's a character that'll show up. And the servant begins to share with Rebekah's family what's going on. He has to sell them on this idea of Rebekah leaving with an utter stranger to go back to some random land to marry Isaac. Okay. At this point in the story, the text tells he's added a nose ring on Rebekah. So I guess that meant you were wealthy. So if you're wearing a nose ring today, congrats. You look at people with nose rings, they got a lot of money. And Laban sees it and he likes money. We'll see later he likes it. That's what he sees. That's what gets him. The text points it out. He sees all these expensive jewelry on her wrist. And so he's impressed Laban enough to at least bring him home. And he's like, hey, I got to share with the entire family before we sit down to eat. And so literally the reason this text is long, he's literally like just retelling us the story through the servant's words. And so he makes it clear, first of all, hey, Isaac was born in Sarah's old age. So I know it doesn't, like the age doesn't seem to make sense, but I promise it does. Like he's not 80 years old and I'm asking you to go marry him. Like Isaac would have been around 40 years old this time, which was a normal age for a suitor. But he makes it known that Isaac has a bunch of possessions that he's set to receive from Abraham. So he's selling it on this, like, hey, Isaac's the sole heir. He's got all this money. But the main selling point he offers, and I love this, after all of this, the main thing he offers is that the God of Abraham has guided this entire process. Look at what he says in verse 48. He says, then I knelt low. This is when he first interacted with Rebekah. He said, I worshiped the Lord. I blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who guided me on the right way to take the granddaughter of my master's brother for his son. So he gives credit to God for this whole process. And then he asks, I love this too, he asks affirmation from the family. What he feels like, he's very clear. This is God moving. This is the Spirit of God at work. But he says, hey, tell me if you're on board too, because if not, I need to go somewhere else. And they're like, no, this is from God. Like, we have no say in the matter. God is at work, which is a healthy way to process how the Spirit is working and moving in our own lives. And so he says, yeah, this is from the Lord. So they affirm it. And then the servant starts giving a bunch of gifts. This is all cultural stuff to Rebekah, to her family. And then he stays the night, and the intention is to get up the next day. I mean, this is moving. You talk about moving fast, right? In a relationship, it's like get up the next day and head back with Rebekah to Abraham and Isaac, right? So this is a real long distance relationship right here. So there's this slight hiccup. They get up the next day ready to go. Rebekah's brother Laban and her mom and his mom, they want her to stay behind for 10 days, which they suggest could be a deceptive thing. I don't know, would make sense if you learn about Laban later. But either way, there's a little bit of like, no, we're ready to go. We want you to stay. So they bring Rebekah forward and ask her opinion. And in verse 58, she simply says, I will go. This is important. First of all, it shows her agency in the decision. She's not just like being stripped away from this, but it also, she becomes kind of a Abraham-like character of faith. She's leaving the same land that Abraham left years before, leaving the same family that Abraham left years before, and agrees to head out, not knowing what the future held. Simply says, I will go. And so her family blesses her in verse 60. This is what they say. They say, our sister, may you become thousands upon 10,000s. That's the promise of a people. May your offspring possess the city gates of their enemies. The promise of a place. It's connecting city gates to the same city gates that Abraham sat at before, but this is bigger and broader. This is the hope. And so they head on out and they take this long journey back, and they get there and they see Isaac in the distance. Rebekah asked the servant, like, hey, who is that? And for the first time, he says, that's Isaac, my master. And so now he's calling Isaac his master instead of his master's son. So again, there is this changing of the guard. Isaac takes Rebekah into his mother's tent, we're told, which that's not weird. It was weird if you asked me about it, but I was like, that's really weird. But what it does is signifying her, she is the new matriarch. They are taking over these possessions, the inheritance. She is the one through whom the promised seed will continue to come forth. And so now in its immediate context, one of the things this text is doing is setting us up to now follow Isaac and Rebekah as they continue to establish this family against all odds, but firmly committed to by God of his own choosing. Because there's an irony in all these stories. The chosen family is still significantly small. There's a reason the text tells us that Abraham's brother had all these people and all these, sons and daughters and all this stuff happening. They're still getting established in this land. In chapter 25, the next chapter, we're going to see Ishmael. And we're going to see he's got 12 sons. And it's this idea of completeness. Like if I was from an earthly perspective, picking someone to move the promised line forth and gain power, it would not be Abraham and Sarah and Rebekah and Isaac. We're going to see in chapter 25, the new matriarch, Rebekah, is also barren. But one thing they have is hope in Yahweh. That he is at work and that his promises will come to pass. And both of these stories serve as a foretaste of those promises. The small deed of property stands as a down payment on the possession of the entire land that was to come one day. And the wedding of Isaac and Rebekah and the blessing of offspring over her, because God will open her womb. It stands as hope that Abraham's people will one day be as numerous as the sands on the seashore and the stars in the sky. God will provide a place and a people. And there is an immediate sense of fulfillment of these things as the Old Testament story unfolds, but it never really wraps up. Like Abraham's descendants do grow into an entire nation, but it has just as much dysfunction as Abraham's family. And they do gain some of the land, but eventually the story ends with them in exile. They don't possess any land, and the people are absolutely scattered. Because like all of humanity, no matter how hard we try to build our own places and build our own people or our own families, our stories are full of rebellion, hurt, pain, brokenness, loss, and death, both as a result of our own sin and those around us. It's no different for us today. The things that our story in the text represent, the promise of a place and the promise of a people, those are the things that our hearts really are after. A place, it's not just about the physical place, but it signifies stability and belonging. A place of security, a place where no one is going hungry, where needs are met. There's no fear of separation or being cast out or the enemy coming in. The idea of a people, it represents a family, a interconnectedness, a dependence, a place of love and laughter and hope. But every time death happens, whether that be physical death or the death of a dream or an idea or a relationship, or every time we face loss and we realize we're really not as secure as we thought we were, we're really not as in control as we thought we were. In those moments, we realize we need something more than just a cute idea about the circle of life. See, if dead things can't be raised again, then the circle of life is nothing more than a philosophical pipe dream. It's a great idea for an animated movie. You know, just stay, nature knows what it's doing. That doesn't give me hope. When sickness tears into the bodies of those I love, when suffering and persecution hit the church, when family dysfunction rears its ugly head, when we feel lonely and left out, when death punches us right in the mouth. What does that do for me? Just trust some, big pie in the sky theory and thing. Like, I need something real. And no matter how much we're told that death is a natural part of life, that's one way we deal with it. When it happens every single time, I don't care how we say, well, they lived a good old life, whatever. Doesn't matter. There's something in us that screams that death isn't okay, because it's not. It was never meant to be this way. Death is not a natural part of life and creation the way God designed it. It's not normal. Loss and separation, not belonging, not fitting in, all of this is a result not of the circle of life, but because of sin. And it sucks. And all of us, Abraham, his servant, Rebekah, Isaac, we need something more than a cute story to deal with the problem of death. We need hope in a resurrection beyond what the eye can see. And Abraham, at least by the end of his life, got this. Sarah, at least by the end of her life, got this. Not just because they made a great logical decision someday, but because God ruthlessly pursued them to this. If we think that Abraham was just looking forward to today when his biological descendants would finally have enough land for stability, build a big enough wall for security, and will finally have enough people to protect it all, like, we're missing it. The scriptures are clear. Look at Hebrews 11. These all died in faith. This is specifically talking about Abraham, Sarah, and the saints of old. Although they didn't receive the things that were promised. Wait, I thought God kept his promises. Oh, he does. But they didn't receive them in the immediate physical way, but they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Now, those who talk like this, those who say such things, make it clear they're seeking a homeland. If they were thinking about where they come from, if they just wanted a physical plot of land, they had an opportunity to get that. They could have got that. They could have returned. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them, a people and a place. We need hope in a God who can raise the dead, who can reverse the curse of sin, who can actually bring real stability, real peace, who can make all sad things come untrue. And that's who Jesus is. He leaves his home. He leaves the splendor of heaven. And he comes himself to earth to get his bride. He didn't send a selfless servant. He became the selfless servant. Took on flesh, humble, the one true God, taking on the flesh of a human, putting our interest above his own. And he shares his inheritance radically with us. And he comes to purchase us at great cost to himself. And here's the things, guys. We are not the willing bride like Rebekah saying, I'll go. No, we kick and scream. We're much more like Hosea's wife, selling ourselves back into prostitution time and time again, chasing other idols, thinking it will fulfill us, and leaving, sitting there on the auction block, naked in sin and shame, chained to our sin. That is the picture that he came to get. But he meets us where we are, and he pays whatever price he has to pay. He wipes our weeping eyes and lifts our weary heads and grants to us all the riches of himself, even though we don't deserve it. What does he say? He says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And I'm going to come again. I'm going to take you to be with myself, belonging, a place of provision and abundance and joy and security. And he will see to it that it's done, even at the expense of his own life. The greatest love story and wooing of a bride was not the servant getting Rebekah for Isaac, but it was the journey of the God-man Christ himself coming to his bride and wooing us unto himself, even when it would cost him greatly. And so to the cross he goes, face set like a flint, and he battles against death itself, facing the final enemy, taking our place on that auction block, becoming sin for us. And it was done in view of all outside the city gates, making sure there's no question what's happening. That's why we're reading Colossians, that all the princes and principalities of the air see this as Jesus takes the certificate of debt that was against us. And in the sight of all, he nails it to the cross, dealing with it once and for all. And his body, his dead body, is laid in a borrowed tomb. There's no need for purchasing land as some small foretaste of possessing more physical land someday. He's got much bigger plans than that. His possession is a whole new people and a whole new creation. That's the entire cosmos, heaven and earth joined together. And so as his body is buried in the dirt, even though the powers of the enemy had done their worst, it simply becomes the seed of the new creation. Yes, sown in weakness, but raised in power on the third day. He's called the first fruits. This is a foretaste for everyone who trusts in his life, death, burial, and resurrection. We become united to him, yes, going with him into death, but raised to receive new life as well. All who have died, united to Christ, including Sarah and the others buried on that plot of land, will all be raised again in the final day, fully, completely, bodily, real. It's tangible. You'll be able to see it and touch it, just like they were able to feel the scars in the hands of Jesus when he raised again. This isn't just a dream. Just as we saw foretaste in our story today of a place and a people, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is all summed up in him, and it points us forward to the new creation. He will return to wipe away all tears. Like, this is what I cry when I see the midst of brokenness. Come quickly, fix this mess, make all things new, end death itself, and he will do it. He will fulfill everything that our hearts long for. And in the here and now, here's the beautiful thing. Just as Abraham and Sarah's story was a foretaste, do you know that that's exactly what we all are? There's a ragtag group of people that we call the church. Don't know why God loves us. He does. The bride of Christ, together. We stand as a foretaste on this side of cross and resurrection. The place where the promise of a people and a place are fulfilled in one organism. That's why we talk about the church. It's the people of God. We're not talking about like a physical building. Yes, like this building can be sacred because anything can be sacred if it's used for the right purposes and for the kingdom. But I mean the people. And so like this is what we become, the church. We become what the place of God represents, a place where stability and security can happen, but not in the way the world thinks, where we build up walls, they don't let anybody come in, but no, rather like the new creation where the gates are open and say, come on in. Like you see in Acts, that's why people are sharing possessions to care for each other. We don't want anybody to lack. Like that's real and tangible. And it's not just money grubbing. It's like, hey, you got someone over here with need. Like we share that. What resources do we have to bring to the table? Because we're a family. That's why it's a place of belonging. And yes, on this side of eternity, we won't do it perfectly. There'll be times where you feel left out. There'll be times where you feel like you don't belong. But here's the thing. We come together not based on anything but the blood of Christ. And we all play a part. Poor, rich, married, single, divorced, young, old, every culture, every ethnicity, joining together. Saying, hey, through the cycles of life, through the ups and the downs, our brothers and sisters in Christ can care for us, grieve with us, and both celebrate with us. So as we lay those we love in the dirt, yes, we grieve. We lament. We say it's not supposed to be this way. We hate this. We hate death. We hate separation. But we don't grieve without hope. Because all who die and are united to Christ, they are simply seeds sown in the ground that will bloom into glorious life. Yes, we mourn loss, separation, dysfunction, brokenness, but we know that resurrection awaits and that somehow all of that is working greater glory in the end, just like the cross did. That's also why we're not just moping around. Yes, we lament when hard things come, but we can celebrate new life with the best of them. We can throw the best freaking parties. We can bring the better wine. I got to officiate a wedding of the daughter of one of our New Eden families last week. And just getting to watch two people display to the world this beautiful picture of God's covenant love, along with others celebrating around them. It's a gift of grace. Getting to celebrate new babies and new life, crying, making noise. We love it. We know that it's a glorious foretaste of even greater life to come. And so we can sit in the tension and be okay with it. As we face sickness and pain and brokenness and barrenness, simultaneously seeing families sometimes fall apart and sometimes seeing families grow together. Like as we face the negative things in life, we know that it's somehow working more glory in the end. But also as we face joy and celebration, we can enjoy it, but we know it's just a small foretaste of something greater to come. We can become a people like Abraham's servant who honor each other above ourselves, outdo one another in showing honor. We don't need credit for what God is doing. It's ultimately his work. That's why we're also a place of prayer, trusting the Spirit of God to work and move. People are like, how do you do that? I was like, I don't know. God's just doing it. We're just like along for the ride. He's working, moving, acting. We back up like Rebekah's family and be like, I don't know, God. What are we going to do? It's God's work. We have no choice in the matter. We're willing to live lives that look beyond this life. It's not just a circle. No, it is like going towards something good and better. So like Abraham, who buys this plot of land as a foretaste of something greater, go build houses, buy dirt, live in them. Love our, I'm quoting a lot of songs today, I don't know why. Love our cities, right? Seek the flourishing. And when people are like, oh, that's just a foretaste to the world. But we also hold all of that with an open hand. We know that we're ultimately strangers and foreigners here. So you want me to sell everything? You want me to leave everything, take the gospel to the ends of the earth? Heck yeah, like let's go. I'm not saying it's easy, but like let's do it. Let's give to that, whatever it is, whatever your role is. I don't know what it is. But we do all this, and when all is said and done, we do it because we know that Jesus is King and Savior. Not just because they're great ideas, not because we're just a part of the circle of life and you better leave it better than you found it. We do this because we have a rock solid hope in a God that can raise the dead, who's building an eternal city, whose foundations cannot be shaken. And just as sure as he got back up out of the grave, it will happen. We look forward to the day when our faith, along with the faith of Abraham and Sarah, it will become sight. And we will receive everything that we've been looking forward to even from all the way back in Genesis. God will see to it that the promise of a place and a people will be fulfilled. And in close, let me read of this day from Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city. So you see, it's a place, the New Jerusalem, right? It's coming down out of heaven from God. It's prepared like a bride, so it's a people adorned for her husband. It's all summed up. Then I heard this loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling, his place is with humanity, his people, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples. God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away. Death is the last thing to die.